Today we're going to talk about the best cards to side deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! What's potion? You got Matt here and welcome to another competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Video. YCS Indy is just a few days away and I wanted to bring you a tier list for the best side deck cards you could possibly be playing in your strategy. The format is pretty diverse, so we're going to be covering a wide range of cards in this video. But first, if you're excited for the video, then make sure to smash the like button. If this video hits 300 likes, I'll bring you the ultimate tier list for the best board breakers in Yu-Gi-Oh! Today. Also, if you like competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, including deck profiles, guides on how to beat the best decks, meta discussions, and videos just like this one, you're gonna love this channel, so make sure to subscribe. But with that being said, here are the best side deck cards for the June 2024 competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Format. Let's jump into it. So I have so many different cards to talk about in this video, and I'm going to be talking about them not as how they are as individual cards, but how they can actually do as side deck cards in the format today. Speaking of which, I have 6 different categories for you, the first of which is going to be main deck mostly. This is for cards that are mostly going to be found in the main deck. We also have amazing side deck cards and solid side deck cards, which both will see play in side decks, but their power levels differentiate them a little bit. Niches for cards that are still going to be usually found in side decks, but for more specific matchups. Better options is for when a card is either just a worse version of another similar card, or what it tries to do is done better by other options. And finally, we have our favorite category, Just Don't, for cards you just should not be playing in this format. The names of these tiers are important. Just because one card just so happens to be 3 rows lower than another card doesn't necessarily mean it's a worse card, it just falls into a different category. That being said, in the interest of not having a 30-minute video where I talk about side deck cards, I'm going to limit how much I talk about each individual card, but I am going to divide them into different categories. The first one we're going to talk about is going to be Handtraps, and the best hand trap to start us off is going to be Ash Blossom. Ash is a fantastic card in this format. There is so much utility that it has. It's able to stop a key effect from pretty much every single competitive deck in the format today, which is a huge deal. Sure, there are some weaknesses to this card, but at the end of the day, it's one of the better cards you're going to see on this list. It belongs in main decks mostly. Up next are Bystials, and Bystials are in a really interesting position because fire decks in the format today, like Snake Eye and its variants, and of course Tenpai Dragon, are 2 of the most dominant strategies in the game today. But it's not to say there aren't some other really good light or dark based decks, like for example Melodious, Branded, Voiceless Voice, and so on. But honestly, is it really worth playing Bystials right now? Well, there is an argument for it, because even a lot of these fire decks, like Snake Eye for example, do have a certain play that can be weak to Bystials in one form or another. For example, Flamber's trying to place the IP Masquerena back in the spell and trap zone is pretty weak to Bystials. But let's be honest, that really isn't good enough to see consistent main deck play unless you're also playing a deck that really focuses a lot on dragon type monsters. I think they're great cards, but they only make sense in very specific situations, so in my opinion, they go into the niche tier. DD Crow is an extremely underrated card in Yu-Gi-Oh! Today. Pretty much every single deck in the format has at least one activation or effect that's going to be weak to DD Crow. And while the upside for cards like Bystials is significantly higher than for DD Crow because of the advantage they can get you while on the field, DD Crow is still extremely flexible, and that gives it the leg up on Bystials in this format. I actually believe that DD Crow is a solid side deck card. Dimension Shifter really only has one possible tier it can be in, and for the most part we know what decks are going to be playing Dimension Shifter. It's going to be strategies like Fluandereeze, Kashtira, Vanquish Soul, and to a lesser extent a deck like Tenpai Dragon. So it's a very hyper-specific card. You need to have the right deck to play it effectively, and for that reason it's automatically a card that will go into the niche tier. Droll and Lockbird is a card that I got way wrong. I expected it to be the next meta-defining hand trap once we got Poplar in the game from Phantom Nightmare, but honestly it's been pretty lackluster. There are some decks that really hate dealing with Droll and Lockbird, but honestly a lot of the top decks in the format today, most notably Tenpai Dragon and Snake Eye, don't really care about it too much. It's a card that has its formats and can definitely help you out a lot, especially against rogue decks, but in the meta today, there are not going to be too many strategies that are weak to this card, so it's not that much of a main deck staple. It's still a great card and an important one to have in your collection, but it's not for every strategy. For that reason, it goes in the solid side deck card tier. Effect Veiler is just basically bad infinite impermanence, which would mean it would usually go into the better options tier. Well, kind of. Because of how good Infinite Impermanence is and how good Handtraps are in the format today, it essentially acts as Imperm number 4, 5, and 6, which does have a role. I don't actually think that Effect Veiler is a better card than something like Dimension Shifter or Droll and Lockbird, but it does something very useful in the format today, and that's Targeted Effect Negation, which comes up a lot. It's a card that very rarely sees any side deck play, but is seeing a lot of play in the format today. So for that reason, it's mostly a main deck card. Speaking of cards that mostly belong in the main deck, we have Infinite Impermanence. This card is arguably the best hand trap in the game and without a doubt belongs mostly in main decks. Moving on to Fantastical Dragon Phantasme. While the reprint in Rarity 2 was appreciated and Link monsters are still pretty important to the game today, Phantasme isn't seeing that much play, and it's for good reason. Think about it, would you really rather play Phantasme or any of the other possible hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh today? Personally, I'd rather have almost any other hand trap than Phantasme, and the reason why it's not as good right now is because there isn't one dominant hand trap in the game today that is really ruining the format. Think back to a few months ago when Phantasme was seeing a lot more play. Most of the time it was being paired with additional hand traps that you'd really want to draw into for certain matchups. For example, Droll and Lockbird. Because there isn't that single dominant hand trap in the format today, it's just not seeing as much play right now. And for that reason, there are better options. Ghost Bell in Haunted Mansion is objectively a good card, but it's not the best in this format. The reason why is because there are so many insanely powerful effects that happen on the field. Just look at the best deck of the format being Snake Eye. Snake Eye is much weaker to targeted effect negation than it is to cards like Ash Blossom or Ghost Bell, at least on most of the cards. But Bell negates activations and not effects, which is really important, especially in the Tenpai Dragon matchup because it can be used in the damage step on the effect of something like Tenpai Dragon Fadra. It does see side deck play, but much less than other hand traps, so I'll put it in niche. Ghost Mourner is another hand trap that offers targeted effect negation, and it's seeing a lot more popularity nowadays because it can be used during either player's turn during any phase. Just like more traditional hand traps like Imperm and Veiler, it does have its weaknesses, but they're few and far between. Because of how good effect negation actually is, Ghost Mourner belongs in the main deck mostly tier. Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit has seen a significant rise in popularity in this format. Basically, every single deck uses a card effect on the field that could be destroyed by Ghost Ogre, which is really nice. And it does get a big bonus when going up against all these field spell or continuous spell based decks, like for example Tenpai Dragon, Voiceless Voice, or Yubel. There's a wide range of strategies that Ghost Ogre can actually hit. The problem is not every deck can play 12 to 15 to 18 different hand traps. So for that reason, Ghost Ogre is an amazing side deck card. Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood will never see main deck play, ever. It's a time card and that's it, and because of that very specific purpose, it's a niche card. As for Nibiru, I think we all expected that with the Omni Negates banned, we'd see a lot more play from Nib. The problem is that Nibiru is still a very good card, but decks have just evolved to the point where they're so recursive that they don't really care too much about Nibiru anymore. Some decks force Nibiru to be used at an unoptimal time, which can be problematic, while others just don't care about the strategy at all, like for example Tenpai Dragon. It's a good card, but only at its best when there are multiple hand traps. And this might be a hot take, but I don't think that Nibiru is a main deck worthy card anymore. But in my opinion, it's an amazing side deck card. And the last hand traps we're going to be talking about today are going to be Psyframe Gear Gamma and Psyframe Gear Delta. Gamma is essentially monster negation, while Delta is going to be spell negation. Both of these cards can be pretty good, but with Gamma limited to one copy, it's just not consistent enough. And that kind of is the whole problem with these two cards. You have to play the driver and you have to not draw it to make it most effective. To keep it brief, it's not very consistent to draw them, and you play a brick in your deck to make your strategy less consistent too. I don't think they should be played, but not because they're bad, just because there are better options. Now let's talk about traditional board breakers, starting off with Book of Moon. I love Book of Moon. It is one of my favorite cards of all time, but I can even acknowledge that it's not at its best right now. Just think of it this way, what would you rather have? Book of Moon or literally any other board breaker in Yu-Gi-Oh today? The majority of people will take almost any other board breaker there is. But it's not because Book of Moon is a bad card. It can still do a lot of really cool things and is still very flexible. But it's not a good card either, and that's the problem. There are so many countless board breakers to use other than Book of Moon, so for that reason, just don't play it. Cosmic Cyclone, in my opinion, should be in almost every single side deck in the game today. It is such an incredibly flexible card that's good offensively and defensively. It's able to get rid of problematic Floodgates, it's able to deal with opposing engine because there are so many cards that need to be on the field as spell and trap cards to resolve their effects. Think of field spells, continuous trap cards, and spell cards, and of course all of these cards that Snake Eyes Flamber's Dragon, that whole strategy, places in their back row. If you can Cosmic Cyclone to get rid of them, you're in a really good spot. Almost every single deck in the format is going to be weak at least in some part to Cosmic Cyclone, and for that reason, Cyclone is easily an amazing side deck card. As for some more traditional board breakers like Dark Hole, Raigeki, Lightning Storm, and Harpy's Feather Duster, all of these cards here are not going to be seeing play in pretty much any main deck with the exception of Tenpai Dragon. So for this example, I'm going to take that deck out of the equation. Dark Hole and Raigeki are good cards. They offer mass removal without paying a cost, which can be really nice. The problem is Yu-Gi-Oh! Is no longer a game about setting up a million negates and more about creating a board that is resilient to board breakers. So if the board gets broken, you can just summon them all back. Just don't play Dark Hole or Raigeki. As for Lightning Storm, it has a lot of flexibility to get rid of both monsters and back row, which comes up quite a bit, and for that reason it does see a good amount of play. That flexibility is why I think it's a solid side deck card. And Harpy's Feather Duster is a great card, but because it's not a quick play spell like Cosmic Cyclone, it tends to see a little bit less play than that one does. But either way, Duster is still a solid side deck card. Dark Ruler No More is in theory a great board breaker. The problem is, in practice, it doesn't really actually do very much. And that's because there are so many cards or effects that activate in the graveyard, in the hand, or are just in the back row already. I mentioned it earlier, but Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't a game that wants to set up a million negates anymore, and that's when Dark Ruler No More is at its best. Just don't play Dark Ruler No More. I love Dino Wrestler Pankratops. I think it's a really well designed card that offers solutions for problems that we have in the game today. The big attack stat, the free body, and of course the quick effect destruction all come up quite handy, but again, it's not the perfect card in this format. Unfortunately, it's a very rare card to see, and for that reason I'll put it in the niche tier. Kashtira Fenrir is a great card, both as a board breaker and as a little Kashtira package that some decks are actually utilizing to keep their card advantage high and give them extra interruption. The thing is, in those strategies that utilize Kashtira Fenrir or the Kashtira engine, they're playing it in the main deck. So for that reason, I'll place it in the main deck mostly tier. Evenly Matched will never see main deck play. It's a fine card overall that had its heyday as one of the most dominant side deck cards in the game. But let's be honest, thanks to SP Little Knight, the card just isn't as strong anymore. On top of that, there are so many great cards that are in the hand or in the graveyard that can activate their effects to help players play around Evenly Matched. For board breakers in the side deck, it's just not at its best this format. There are better options. But then we have Forbidden Droplet, which is a great card even though the cost for it is pretty steep. But think about it this way. You have Voiceless Voice, which puts up protection from targeting, but Forbidden Droplet doesn't target. Tenpai Dragon activates a lot of cards in the damage step, but so can Droplet. Droplet reduces stats, which means it can be activated in damage step in response to a Tenpai Dragon attack, which is very critical. We also have a way to play around a lot of cards that would target your own cards by getting them off the field. If your opponent has an already established board, they try to activate Infinite Impermanence on your card by targeting it, you can use Droplet to dodge that effect and have your own effect resolve, which will be really nice. And there are so many other ways to effectively use Forbidden Droplet. In my opinion, it's an amazing side deck card. Herald of the Abyss as a board breaker is pretty limited in its application. It's really only good against Pearly and maybe Raid Raptor, but even then it's kind of tough to decide if it's even going to be worth your while. Considering that Pearly doesn't have the highest representation in the format, it's probably not going to be in your best interest to play it. So for that reason, just don't play Herald of the Abyss. Up next, we have the cards that would tribute opposing monsters, like Kaijus, Lava Golem, and Sphere Mode, and of course Santa Claus as well. Honestly, all of these cards are pretty limited in their application in this format. Sphere Mode is pretty bad because a lot of the time there aren't going to be 3 really threatening cards on the field, or there's just going to be 2 or fewer monsters, which can be problematic. Lava Golem wastes your normal summon, especially because it gives your opponent a fire type monster, which means they can still activate the effect of Promethean Princess. And then we have Kaijus and Santa Claus, and while they each have their own application, they really aren't seeing very much play across the board, because very few decks actually need to have Kaijus or Santa Claus to effectively out certain threats. In my opinion, you're better off playing other cards, so all 3 will go into the just don't tier. Kurikara Div Incarnate is not a great card in this format. It can get rid of a lot of really big threats, but it relies heavily on what your opponent is doing. and in a format where there are so few mandatory activated effects, it's really hard to justify using Kurikara in your strategy. But it is a level 1 fire monster, meaning it is searchable off of something like Snake Eye Ash if you're playing that package. At most, it's a niche card. Just a few months ago, Soul Release was one of the best board breakers in the entire game because of how it could handle the Snake Eye Fire King end board. But since then, Snake Eye Fire King has become one of the less popular versions of the Snake Eye variants, with Melodious and Kashtira and even Pure becoming a bit more popular. And with Snake Eye Fire King becoming a lot less popular, so has Soul Release. It would be a different story if it was good against all these other strategies, but it just isn't as impactful as it needs to be. Just don't play Soul Release. Triple Tactic Talents is awesome in this format because we are in a very heavy hand trap based format. Just think of a lot of decks in the game today. We have like 12 to 18 spots dedicated for non-engine, and hand traps make up a large variety of those spots. Because most hand traps are going to be monsters, talents can be turned on, which is really good to either draw cards, interrupt your opponent by getting rid of their most powerful starter, or even take control of their monster. It's a really awesome card in this format, but it'll pretty much only see play in main decks. I'm sure some side decks play it, but right now it mostly belongs in main decks. Triple Tactics Thrust, on the other hand, is one of the best cards we've spoken about today. The card can search out pretty much any normal spell or trap, which is really good and has a lot of application. The issue is that right now, while there are so many different hand traps in the game today, it's not going to be as impactful as it needs to be because you can't guarantee your opponent will have a monster on the field to get the max benefit from this card. But even with that being said, some decks really like it in the main, others are kind of indifferent about it, but honestly, the majority of decks don't even play it in the side deck unless they have a really specific card they want to search out. So for that reason, Triple Tactics Thrust is a niche card. Super Polymerization is a card people have been asking to be hit on the ban list for quite some time. It's actually being used right now in a few different strategies as part of their engine, whether it's going to be in Branded or in something like YuBell. But how does it perform as a board breaker? Well, most decks right now don't have that much space in their extra deck for Super Poly targets, especially considering that it's not going to be the most impactful against a lot of strategies in the game today. Because we're in such a heavy hand trap based format, board breakers need to be incredible to have a really good shot at consistently seeing play in most main decks. And let's be honest, right now, Super Polymerization just isn't as good as it needs to be. There are better options. Now for some Floodgates, which are always going to be popular in side decks, starting off with Anti-Spell Fragrance, which is now limited to 1 copy. Even with that at 1, it's still going to see some play because it's a really good Floodgate in the format today with so many spell cards running around. If you're going first up against a Tenpai Dragon player and you activate something like Anti-Spell, you're going to have a really good time trying to stop their OTK, assuming you have 1, maybe a second interruption. It's not going to come up very consistently thanks to it being only at 1, but either way, it's an amazing side card. Deck Lockdown is the newest Floodgate of choice for so many players. It's a fantastic option because as a continuous spell, you can go through your full combo and then slap it down and force your opponent to out it before they try and go through their full combo. It's not a card that's going to win a game on its own, but it's still a great option against so many different strategies that need to search or special summon from the deck. It belongs in the amazing side deck card tier. Skill Drain is a bit more situational than the other Floodgates we've talked about today, but it is still very good. If your deck can summon out a bunch of really big monsters or activates effects in the graveyard, then it really doesn't hurt you at all, and a lot of other strategies are pretty weak to it because of what their actual effects really are. Because using Skill Drain is a lot more reliant on the deck you're actually using, it belongs in the niche tier. Up next is Dimensional Barrier, which is a great card in this format. Pretty much all of the top tier decks have at least some sort of weakness to D-Barrier because they don't all utilize only Link monsters. The one exception is basically pure Snake Eye, and even then they do tend to play Synchro monsters because of the Jet Synchron package. It's a card that can be an auto win against so many different decks, so for that reason it's an amazing side deck card. As for Simul Archfiends, which is another really good card that's kind of similar to Dimensional Barrier, except it can hit Link monsters while also hitting Synchros, Xyz, and so on. It's a really solid card that's seeing a lot more play in side decks for the time being, but it's not as popular as Dimensional Barrier is just yet. It definitely deserves to see some play, but if your deck ends on IP Masquerena or a way to Synchro on your opponent's turn, it's definitely not going to be in the cards for you. So for that reason, it's a solid side deck card. So my full tier list is looking like this over here, and I think it's pretty good, but if you think I made any mistakes, then let me know down in the comments below. Also, if there's a card that I didn't talk about in the video and you want my opinion on it, make sure to let me know as well. You made it this far in the video, so you must have enjoyed it, so make sure to smash the like button and of course subscribe to the channel for more amazing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh videos. Check me out on Twitter and join the Discord server, both of which are linked in the description, and of course thank you to our channel members as well. Your support goes a long way to helping the channel grow, and if you want to become a channel member, click the join button down below. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.